Imagine it's not 2026. There's no electricity, no cities, no roads, no clocks telling you how late it is, no endless notifications fighting for your attention. Instead, you're sitting beside a crackling fire nearly 50,000 years ago. Night has swallowed the landscape. Beyond the orange glow, darkness stretches in every direction. Somewhere in that darkness, predators are moving. Maybe wolves. Maybe something much worse. The fire is the only thing standing between your family and the wilderness. You stare into the flames. The wood pops. Sparks drift upward, and smoke rolls across the camp before blowing straight into your face. You cough. Everyone coughs. That's just part of life. But then something strange happens. A nearby plant catches in the fire. The smoke smells different. Not bad. Different. A little sweeter. A little stronger. A little interesting. Minutes later, you feel unusual. Relaxed. Lighter. Maybe your thoughts seem slower. Maybe colors seem brighter. Maybe the stories around the fire suddenly feel more fascinating than they did a few minutes ago. You don't know what happened. You don't have chemistry. You don't have biology. You don't even have a word for what you're experiencing. All you know is that something changed. And that tiny moment may have been the beginning of one of humanity's oldest habits. Not cigarettes. Not cigars. Not vaping. Not tobacco. Something much older. The deliberate act of breathing in smoke because of what it does to the mind. And if that sounds unlikely, the evidence becomes surprisingly compelling once you start digging into human history. Because smoking didn't begin with agriculture. It didn't begin with civilizations. It didn't begin with written language. In fact, it may have roots that stretch back so far that no one will ever know exactly when it started. To understand why, we have to begin with a much bigger discovery. Fire. Because before humans could smoke anything intentionally, they first had to master the thing that made smoking possible. And humans have been living alongside fire for an unbelievably long time. The oldest convincing evidence for controlled fire use dates back, roughly, 1 million years. Think about that number for a moment. 1 million years. Modern civilization is only a few thousand years old. Recorded history covers an even smaller slice of time. 1 million years takes us into a world that feels almost alien. Back then, Homo sapiens didn't even exist. The beings gathering around those ancient fires were likely Homo erectus, our distant relatives. They looked different. Their brains were smaller. Their faces were heavier. Their lives were harder. But they understood something incredibly important. Fire changed everything. It provided warmth, protection, light, cooked food, a gathering place, a reason for groups to stay together after sunset. For perhaps the first time in evolutionary history, darkness no longer meant the day was over. People could sit together and talk, share knowledge, teach children, tell stories, plan hunts, build relationships. In many ways, fire may have created the first true social spaces. But fire came with something else. Smoke. Massive amounts of smoke. Every evening, every season, every year, generation after generation. Ancient humans spent enormous portions of their lives breathing smoke. Unlike us, they couldn't step outside for fresh air. The smoke was everywhere. It filled caves. It lingered around camps. It clung to clothing and skin. If you lived near a fire, inhaling smoke wasn't a choice. It was unavoidable, and that detail matters. Because smoke is rarely just smoke. When plants burn, they release a complicated mixture of chemicals. Different plants create different effects. Some produce pleasant smells. Some create irritating fumes. And some release compounds that interact directly with the human nervous system. Compounds capable of changing mood, changing perception, changing consciousness itself. Imagine discovering that accidentally. Not in a laboratory. Not through scientific research, but through simple observation. You burn one type of plant. Nothing happens. You burn another. You feel calmer. You burn a third. Everyone around the fire starts laughing more than usual. Over enough time, patterns become obvious. Humans are exceptionally good at noticing patterns. It's one of the reasons we survived. If eating a certain berry made someone sick, people remembered. If a particular watering hole attracted dangerous predators, people remembered. And if certain plants produced smoke that created unusual mental effects, people probably remembered that too. That's where an intriguing possibility emerges. Perhaps the earliest smoking wasn't invented. Perhaps it was discovered. An accident repeated enough times that it eventually became intentional. Picture a hunter noticing that every time a specific plant burned, the evening felt different. More peaceful, more vivid, more enjoyable. Eventually, curiosity takes over. What happens if we throw more of that plant in a fire? What happens if we sit closer? What happens if we breathe deeper? Without realizing it, those ancient experiments may have laid the foundation for thousands of years of human behavior. And the fascinating thing is that our brains seem surprisingly prepared for such experiences. Take cannabis as an example. Many people assume humans evolved special responses because cannabis existed. The reality is more interesting. Human beings possess an entire biological system called the endocannabinoid system. It helps regulate appetite, memory, mood, sleep, stress responses. The system evolved long before humans intentionally used cannabis. But when cannabinoids enter the body, they fit into receptors that are already there, like keys sliding into locks that were waiting to be used. In other words, when the first human accidentally inhaled smoke containing cannabinoid compounds, their brain wasn't encountering something completely foreign. The machinery was already in place. The result may have felt surprisingly natural. And that raises a provocative question. How many prehistoric discoveries happened exactly this way? No grand invention, no genius breakthrough, just someone noticing that a particular plant changed how they felt. History often imagines ancient people as primitive, but in reality, they were careful observers of the world around them. Their survival depended on it. They knew animal behavior, weather patterns, seasonal changes, plant properties, migration routes, water sources. They possessed enormous amounts of practical knowledge gained through experience rather than textbooks. So if certain plants consistently produced interesting effects when burned, it would have been almost impossible not to notice. And once noticed, it would have been nearly impossible to forget. Think about the implications. Long before cities, long before kings, long before writing, humans may already have been experimenting with altered states of consciousness around campfires. Not because they were trying to create a ritual, not because they were trying to start a tradition, but because curiosity is one of the most powerful forces in human history. The same curiosity that pushed people across oceans. The same curiosity that sent rockets into space. The same curiosity that drove countless discoveries. It may also have inspired someone to lean a little closer to the smoke, and then do it again, and eventually teach someone else. The remarkable thing is that none of this requires a civilization. It only requires fire, plants, observation, and a brain capable of connecting cause and effect. A brain capable of saying, something happened last time. I want to see if it happens again. That simple thought may be one of the most important ideas humans ever developed, because it lies at the heart of experimentation itself. And somewhere in the distant past, beside a fire whose ashes vanished tens of thousands of years ago, somebody may have conducted one of the earliest experiments in human history. Not with tools, not with machines, but with smoke. And the consequences of that discovery would echo through every continent humans eventually settled. Because what started as an accident around a prehistoric campfire would eventually become ritual, medicine, religion, tradition, business, and eventually one of the most controversial habits on Earth. But before we get there, we need to examine the actual evidence. Because while accidental smoke exposure may be ancient, proving intentional smoking is much harder. And the archaeological trail that follows is one of the most fascinating mysteries in human history. Here's where the story gets tricky. It's one thing to imagine ancient humans accidentally inhaling smoke around a campfire. It's another thing entirely to prove they were doing it on purpose. And that's the problem archaeologists face. The further back in time you go, the harder it becomes to find evidence. Stone tools survive. Bones sometimes survive. But leaves? Seeds? Bundles of dried herbs? Wooden pipes? Those things disappear. They rot. They break down. They return to the earth long before anyone arrives with a shovel and a notebook. That's why ancient smoking is such a difficult mystery to solve. The absence of evidence doesn't necessarily mean the behavior didn't exist. It may simply mean the evidence didn't survive long enough for us to find it. Imagine someone drops a stone spearhead. 10,000 years later, an archaeologist might discover it. Now imagine someone drops a pouch of dried leaves. 10,000 years later, there's almost nothing left. The object vanishes. The behavior remains invisible. This creates one of the biggest blind spots in human history. Many ancient practices involving plants may have existed for thousands of years before they ever left a trace that could survive. And smoking is a perfect example, because by the time archaeologists begin finding convincing evidence, the practice already appears surprisingly developed. That usually means people have been doing it for a very long time beforehand. Human traditions rarely appear overnight. They evolve, they spread, they become refined over generations. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating discoveries ever made. High in the mountains of Central Asia, archaeologists uncovered clues hidden inside ancient burial sites. At first glance, the artifacts didn't look extraordinary. There were wooden containers, heated stones, fragments of plant residue. Nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed historical breakthrough. But once scientists examined the residue more closely, a remarkable picture began to emerge. The containers appeared to have been used as primitive burners. The stones had been heated to extremely high temperatures, and traces of cannabis compounds remained behind. Not ordinary cannabis. Cannabis containing unusually high levels of psychoactive chemicals. In other words, people weren't simply collecting random plants. They appear to be selecting plants specifically because of their effects. That's a very different story. Now we're no longer talking about accidental exposure. We're talking about deliberate choices. Someone gathered these plants. Someone prepared them. Someone heated the stones. Someone created conditions specifically designed to produce smoke. And someone intentionally inhaled it. The evidence dates back roughly 25 centuries. Old enough to feel ancient. Yet probably only a small chapter in a much longer story. Because if people were already conducting sophisticated smoke rituals by that time, where did the idea originate? Traditions don't appear fully formed. They grow from earlier practices, and earlier practices usually grow from even older ones. The trail was leading researchers deeper into the past. Then another clue appeared. This one came from an unexpected source, an ancient Greek historian. For centuries, historians treated many ancient writers with caution. After all, ancient authors often mixed facts with rumors. They exaggerated. They misunderstood foreign cultures. They sometimes repeated stories that sounded exciting rather than accurate. So when a Greek historian described a group of nomadic horse-riding people engaging in strange, smoke-filled ceremonies, many scholars assumed the account was exaggerated. The story sounded almost unbelievable. According to the description, these nomads would construct enclosed spaces using animal hides or tents. Inside, they placed red-hot stones. Then they threw hemp onto the heated surfaces. Smoke filled the enclosure. The participants sat inside, and according to the account, they reacted with obvious delight. The historian described them practically shouting with joy. For centuries, many readers dismissed the story. Surely it was exaggerated. Surely something had been misunderstood. Then archaeologists started digging, and they found something remarkable. The physical evidence matched the written account. Again and again. Burners, heated stones, plant residues. Everything lined up. The ancient writer wasn't inventing a story. He was describing something real, a ritual centered around inhaling smoke. Suddenly, what once sounded unbelievable became one of the strongest pieces of evidence for intentional smoking in the ancient world. And the implications were enormous, because these people weren't smoking casually. This wasn't the equivalent of someone stepping outside for a quick break. The smoke existed within a social context, a ceremonial context, possibly even a spiritual one. The experience mattered. The ritual mattered. The shared participation mattered. And that pattern begins appearing everywhere we look. Across ancient societies, smoke repeatedly appears alongside ceremonies, gatherings, and important cultural moments. It's almost as if humans discovered very early that certain substances could influence not only individuals, but entire groups. Think about what happens when people share a powerful experience. Whether it's music, a celebration, a religious ceremony, or even a dramatic event. Shared experiences create bonds. They strengthen trust. They make people feel connected. Ancient smoke rituals may have served a similar purpose. Groups entering altered states together could have reinforced social ties in ways that ordinary activities could not. Modern science actually supports this idea. Shared rituals increase feelings of belonging. They encourage cooperation. They help create group identity. For ancient communities, those benefits weren't trivial. They were survival advantages. Groups that trusted one another survived better than groups that didn't. So when people gathered around smoke-producing ceremonies, they weren't necessarily chasing entertainment. They may have been strengthening the social glue that held their communities together. That's a powerful possibility, and it helps explain why these practices appear repeatedly throughout history. But there's another challenge. Even when evidence exists, it's often frustratingly incomplete. Archaeology rarely gives us perfect answers. Imagine discovering a 1,000-year-old fireplace. You might know what burned there. You might know roughly what happened. But you usually don't know exactly what people were thinking. Were they seeking spiritual visions, medical treatment, relaxation, group bonding, a combination of all four? The artifacts remain silent. Researchers must piece together the story from fragments. And sometimes those fragments raise even bigger questions. For example, what if ancient humans had been experimenting with psychoactive smoke thousands of years before the earliest evidence we possess? What if entire traditions existed and disappeared without leaving traces behind? It's entirely possible. In fact, many archaeologists believe the true origins of smoking are likely far older than any direct evidence we've discovered. Not because they're guessing, because that's often how human behavior works. Practices emerge long before they become visible in the archaeological record. Agriculture existed before the oldest farms we've found. Language existed before writing. Stories existed before books. And smoking may have existed long before the earliest surviving artifacts. Which leads to a fascinating realization. The evidence we're finding may not represent the beginning. It may represent a snapshot, a brief, surviving glimpse of something already ancient. By the time history begins recording human behavior, smoke is already everywhere. Different cultures use different plants, different techniques, different ceremonies, but the underlying behavior keeps appearing. Humans inhale smoke. Humans assign meaning to it. Humans build traditions around it. Again and again and again. That repetition is difficult to ignore. Because when completely different cultures arrive at similar behaviors independently, it often suggests something deeper is happening, something rooted in human nature itself. And that idea would eventually lead researchers toward a controversial but fascinating theory. A theory suggesting that the desire to alter consciousness may be one of humanity's oldest instincts. Not a cultural invention, not a historical accident, but something woven into our species from the very beginning. And once we examine that possibility, the story becomes even more surprising. Because the next chapter isn't just about smoking. It's about why humans seem so determined to change the way their minds experience reality. If you ask most people what ancient smoking was about, they'll probably give the same answer. Tobacco. And that's understandable. Today, smoking and tobacco are almost inseparable in the public imagination. But historically, that's not even close to the full story. In fact, tobacco represents only one chapter in a much older human relationship with smoke. And surprisingly, some of the oldest evidence doesn't come from Europe, Asia, or Africa. It comes from the Americas. Long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, indigenous peoples throughout North and South America had already developed complex traditions involving tobacco. To them, tobacco wasn't simply a product. It wasn't a hobby. It wasn't something consumed out of boredom. It held meaning, deep meaning. The plant occupied a place somewhere between medicine, ritual, and spirituality. In many communities, tobacco was treated with a level of respect that would seem unusual to modern audiences. People didn't necessarily use it every day. They didn't always use it casually. Instead, it often appeared during important moments. Ceremonies, agreements, healing rituals, community gatherings, spiritual practices. The smoke itself was frequently viewed as something special. A bridge, a messenger, a connection between the visible world and something beyond it. Whether those beliefs were literally true isn't really the point. What matters is that people treated the act with seriousness. The ritual mattered just as much as the substance itself. And archaeology suggests these traditions stretch back thousands of years. Researchers have discovered traces of tobacco use dating back several millennia. Ancient pipes, chemical residues, burned remains, evidence scattered across different regions of North America. Every new discovery pushes the timeline further into the past, and some findings are particularly intriguing. At one ancient site, researchers uncovered evidence suggesting wild tobacco may have been used roughly 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years. Think about how extraordinary that number is. At that point, many of humanity's most famous civilizations didn't exist. The pyramids didn't exist. The Roman Empire didn't exist. Writing systems hadn't emerged in most of the world. Yet people may already have been experimenting with tobacco and smoke. That's a staggering thought, because it suggests that humanity's interest in altering consciousness predates almost everything we normally associate with civilization. But here's the truly fascinating part. Even if tobacco use goes back 12,000 years, humans themselves go back much further. Hundreds of thousands of years further. Which raises an obvious question. If people were using tobacco 12,000 years ago, what were humans elsewhere doing with their own local plants? Africa had psychoactive plants. Asia had psychoactive plants. Europe had psychoactive plants. Australia had psychoactive plants. Human beings lived across all of those regions. And humans share something remarkably consistent regardless of location. Curiosity, especially curiosity about the mind, about dreams, about visions, about unusual experiences, about anything capable of making reality feel different. That's where researchers encounter one of the most provocative ideas in anthropology, an idea known as the intoxication hypothesis. At first glance, it sounds almost absurd. The theory proposes that the desire to alter consciousness may be a fundamental biological drive, not a modern habit, not a cultural invention, a deep instinct, something woven into behavior itself. The argument begins with a simple observation. Look at human history. Anywhere, any era, any continent, humans repeatedly discover ways to alter their mental state. They ferment fruits. They brew alcohol. They chew leaves. They inhale smoke. They consume mushrooms. They create rituals centered around consciousness-changing substances. And they do this independently, again and again. Cultures separated by oceans often arrive at surprisingly similar behaviors. Why? Some researchers argue that such consistency is difficult to explain as pure coincidence. Perhaps humans seek altered states because the desire itself serves an evolutionary purpose. Perhaps changing consciousness isn't a mistake. Perhaps it's part of being human. And the evidence becomes even stranger when we look beyond our own species. Because humans aren't the only creatures that seek intoxication. Far from it. Animals do it too. Elephants have been observed seeking out naturally fermented fruit. Certain birds intentionally consume berries that produce intoxicating effects. Monkeys have shown interest in alcoholic fruit. Various species repeatedly interact with substances that alter behavior. And then there are the famous reindeer. The story sounds so bizarre that many people assume it's fictional. But it's real. In parts of northern Eurasia, reindeer have been observed consuming psychoactive mushrooms. Not only that, some observations suggest they actively seek opportunities to experience the effects. The behavior appears intentional, not accidental. Intentional. That's a remarkable detail, because it suggests the attraction to altered states may run deeper than culture, deeper than language, possibly deeper than humanity itself. Now, none of this proves ancient humans were smoking cannabis around campfires 100,000 years ago. Evidence still matters, and evidence has limits. But it does change how we think about the question. Instead of asking, why would ancient people do this? Researchers increasingly ask, why wouldn't they? Imagine living in a world without modern entertainment. No movies, no books, no internet, no recorded music, no virtual worlds, no artificial stimulation. The natural world was everything. And within that natural world existed countless plants capable of affecting perception. Sooner or later, people were going to discover them. Not because they were reckless, because they were observant. The same observations that taught people which plants cured illness could also teach them which plants altered mood. Knowledge accumulated slowly, generation after generation. A discovery made by one person became a lesson shared with children. Those children taught their own children. And over centuries, simple observations transformed into traditions. That's how most human knowledge survived before writing. Not in libraries, not in books, in memory, in stories, around campfires, passed from one voice to another. Imagine a prehistoric elder pointing toward a particular plant, not because it was food, not because it was dangerous, but because it did something unusual, something worth remembering. That lesson might survive for hundreds of generations, long enough to become culture, long enough to become ritual, long enough to become identity. And that's exactly what appears to happen across the archaeological record. Smoking wasn't merely about chemicals. It became woven into human meaning-making, into ceremonies, into medicine, into social bonding, into spirituality. Different cultures interpreted the experience differently, but they kept returning to the same basic behavior. They inhaled smoke, they observed its effects, and they assigned significance to what they felt. Yet there's another chapter to this story that often gets overlooked, a chapter that may explain why smoking survived for so long. Because before smoke became ritual, before it became recreation, before it became tradition, it may have become something even more important: medicine. And once ancient societies began treating smoke as a medical tool, its role in human history expanded dramatically. The next stage of the story takes us into ancient Egypt, India, Greece, and other early civilizations where inhaled smoke wasn't viewed as a vice at all. It was viewed as treatment. And for thousands of years, people genuinely believed that breathing certain types of smoke could heal the body. Sometimes, surprisingly, they weren't entirely wrong. For most of modern history, smoking has carried a negative reputation. Mention smoke, and people immediately think about disease, addiction, and warning labels. But if you traveled back a few thousand years and told ancient physicians that inhaling smoke was dangerous, many of them would have looked at you with complete confusion. Because for much of human history, smoke wasn't considered a problem. It was considered a treatment. In fact, some of the earliest doctors on Earth intentionally prescribed smoke to their patients. And while that sounds absurd from a modern perspective, the reasoning behind it was actually more logical than you might expect. Imagine you're an ancient healer. Someone arrives struggling to breathe. Their chest feels tight. Their throat is swollen. They have no antibiotics, no inhalers, no modern medicine, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. But they do understand one thing. Certain plants seem to affect the body. Some reduce pain. Some induce sleep. Some calm anxiety. Some open the airways. The challenge is finding a way to deliver those effects. Eventually, someone has an idea. What if the healing properties of a plant could be carried directly into the lungs? And just like that, smoke becomes medicine. One of the oldest surviving medical documents in history comes from ancient Egypt. The text contains hundreds of treatments for various illnesses and conditions. Among them are descriptions involving the inhalation of smoke from specially prepared herbs. To modern ears, it sounds backwards. If someone has breathing problems, why would you encourage them to inhale smoke? But ancient healers weren't thinking about smoke itself. They were thinking about the plants inside it. Certain herbs contained compounds capable of affecting the respiratory system. When burned, those compounds traveled directly into the body through the lungs. From their perspective, the method made perfect sense. And surprisingly, the basic concept survives today. Modern medicine still delivers treatments through inhalation. Asthma inhalers, nebulizers, anesthetic gases. The technology changed. The principle remained. Using the lungs as a delivery system is still one of the fastest ways to introduce substances into the body. Ancient physicians didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood the results. And results were often enough. The same pattern appears elsewhere. In ancient Greece, healers regularly experimented with aromatic vapors and herbal smoke. Medical writers described various inhalation therapies designed to treat respiratory conditions and other ailments. Again, the goal wasn't intoxication. It was treatment. The smoke served as a vehicle, a way to transport the effects of medicinal plants into the body. Of course, not every treatment worked. Ancient medicine included plenty of mistakes. Some remedies were ineffective. Others were probably harmful. But occasionally, a treatment succeeded often enough to survive. And when that happened, the knowledge spread. Generation after generation. Physician to apprentice. Parent to child. Community to community. Over time, smoke became part of organized healing traditions. Perhaps nowhere is this clearer than in ancient India. Thousands of years ago, practitioners of Ayurvedic medicine developed sophisticated systems involving medicinal inhalation. These weren't random experiments. They followed detailed procedures. Specific herbs, specific preparations, specific purposes. Certain mixtures were recommended for particular conditions. Others were avoided. The practice became refined through centuries of observation. Whether every treatment worked is beside the point. What matters is that people took the practice seriously. Smoke wasn't viewed as a recreational activity. It was considered a legitimate medical tool. And India wasn't unique. Across China, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and countless other societies, similar patterns emerge. Different cultures, different plants, different beliefs. Yet the same basic idea appears repeatedly. Humans discovered that inhaling substances could change how the body felt. And once they realized that, they began experimenting, sometimes successfully, sometimes disastrously, but always persistently. That's one of the most remarkable things about human beings. When we discover something that appears useful, we rarely stop exploring it. We refine it, modify it, improve it, pass it on. The result is that smoke became embedded in multiple aspects of life simultaneously. Medicine, religion, ritual, social gatherings, each influencing the others. And eventually those boundaries started to blur. Because imagine what happens when medicinal treatment also changes mood, or when a spiritual ritual creates feelings of calm and connection, or when a communal ceremony leaves participants feeling closer to one another. The experience becomes bigger than the original purpose. It becomes meaningful, and meaning is powerful. In many ancient communities, shared smoke rituals evolved into important social events. People gathered together, not because they were sick, not because they required treatment, but because the experience itself created something valuable. Connection. Modern neuroscience helps explain why. Humans are intensely social creatures. For most of our evolutionary history, survival depended on belonging to a group. A lone individual faced enormous risks. Groups provided protection, food, cooperation, knowledge. The stronger the social bonds, the greater the chances of survival. As a result, humans evolved psychological systems that reward connection. We enjoy shared experiences. We trust people who participate in rituals alongside us. We feel closer to those who experience important moments together. Even today, collective experiences can create surprisingly powerful emotional bonds. Concerts, religious ceremonies, sporting events, festivals. People often leave these experiences feeling connected to strangers they had never met before. Ancient rituals likely produced similar effects. When a group gathered around a fire and shared an unusual experience together, something important happened. They synchronized. Emotionally, socially, psychologically. The ritual became a tool for building trust. A kind of social technology long before anyone invented the word technology. Think about a small prehistoric community. Every hunting expedition carries risk. Every migration involves uncertainty. Every winter threatens survival. Trust matters. Cooperation matters. Anything capable of strengthening group cohesion becomes incredibly valuable. Shared rituals accomplish exactly that. They create a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a feeling that everyone is part of something larger than themselves. And smoke often sat at the center of those experiences. The smoke wasn't merely being inhaled. It was being interpreted. The swirling shapes, the unusual sensations, the atmosphere created by firelight and darkness. All of it contributed to the experience. Humans naturally search for meaning. We always have. When something powerful happens, we want to understand it. We want to explain it. We want to fit it into a larger story. That's exactly what ancient cultures did. Some viewed smoke as a bridge to the spiritual world. Others saw it as a path to healing. Others considered it a sacred gift. Different explanations. Same behavior. And that behavior continued spreading across civilizations for thousands of years. By the time recorded history becomes widespread, smoke rituals are everywhere. Not identical, not connected, but remarkably similar. It's almost as if different societies kept rediscovering the same idea. That smoke could do more than affect the body. It could affect the mind, the group, the culture, the story people told about themselves. But eventually something changed. A plant from the Americas would cross the ocean. Empires would become involved. Trade networks would expand. And a practice that had once been sacred, ceremonial, medicinal, and communal would begin transforming into something entirely different. Something commercial, something global, something far more dangerous than most ancient societies could ever have imagined. Because the next chapter of this story isn't about shamans or healers. It's about merchants, factories, advertising, and one of the most successful and destructive businesses in human history. For thousands of years, smoking occupied a strange place in human society. It was medicine. It was ritual. It was spirituality. It was community. But it wasn't yet what we would recognize today. That would change when two worlds collided, and the consequences would reshape human history. Imagine you're a European sailor arriving in the Americas for the first time. Everything feels unfamiliar. The plants are different. The animals are different. The people are different. Even the air seems different. Then you notice something unusual. People carrying small bundles of burning leaves. They're inhaling the smoke, exhaling it through their mouths and noses, doing so with complete confidence, as though it's the most ordinary thing in the world. To the newcomers, the sight must have looked bizarre. Why would anyone willingly breathe smoke? The question seems obvious now, but at the time it was genuinely confusing. Early explorers recorded detailed descriptions of what they saw. Some were fascinated. Others were skeptical. A few were outright disturbed. Yet curiosity has always been one of humanity's strongest instincts. And curiosity rarely stays satisfied for long. Eventually, somebody decided to try it. Then somebody else. Then somebody else. And before long, a plant that had been deeply rooted in indigenous traditions began spreading far beyond the Americas. At first, tobacco was treated as an exotic novelty. Something unusual. Something foreign. Something worth talking about. People brought seeds home. Merchants carried samples across oceans. Travelers shared stories. Doctors experimented with it. Nobles became intrigued by it. Within a surprisingly short period of time, tobacco was appearing in places where nobody had even heard of it a generation earlier. And that's where the story starts moving very quickly. Because unlike many cultural traditions, tobacco possessed a unique advantage. People liked it. A lot. Some enjoyed the calming effects. Others enjoyed the stimulation. Many simply enjoyed the ritual. Whatever the reason, demand grew. And where demand exists, business soon follows. Merchants realized there was money to be made. a great deal of money. Ships began transporting tobacco across enormous distances. Farms expanded. Trade routes multiplied. Markets emerged. Entire economies started revolving around the plant. What had once been a regional tradition was becoming a global commodity. By the 17th century, tobacco had transformed from curiosity into obsession. Across Europe, smoking spread through every level of society. Rich and poor, soldiers and merchants, aristocrats and laborers. Everyone seemed interested. Some people smoked pipes. Others preferred cigars. Some inhaled powdered tobacco through their noses. Each culture developed its own preferences, its own customs, its own rituals. But the common thread remained the same. Tobacco was everywhere, and it wasn't slowing down. The growth was extraordinary. Generation after generation adopted the habit. Governments taxed it. Businesses profited from it. Farmers depended on it. Entire industries emerged around it. In many ways, tobacco became one of the first truly global products. A plant once confined to specific regions of the Americas was now influencing economies across continents. And yet something important had been lost along the way. The original context. Remember how many indigenous societies viewed tobacco? It wasn't merely a product. It was often surrounded by rules, ceremonies, boundaries, responsibilities. The act carried meaning. There were expectations regarding when it should be used and why. In many cases, moderation was built directly into the tradition. But commercial markets operate differently. A business grows by selling more. A business succeeds by expanding consumption. The incentives are completely different. Slowly, the focus shifted. The goal was no longer preserving a sacred tradition. The goal was increasing demand. And once that transformation began, there was no turning back. The Industrial Revolution accelerated everything. Machines changed manufacturing. Transportation improved. Production exploded. Products that once required significant effort could now be produced on an enormous scale. Then came one of the most important inventions in the history of tobacco, the cigarette-making machine. Before its arrival, producing cigarettes required substantial manual labor. Afterward, millions could be manufactured quickly and cheaply. Suddenly, smoking became more convenient than ever before, more accessible than ever before, and far more profitable than ever before. Consumption skyrocketed. Factories expanded. Brands competed aggressively. Advertising became increasingly sophisticated. What had once been a plant became a business empire. And business empires rarely leave growth to chance. Companies wanted customers. More customers. Younger customers. Loyal customers. Customers who would keep buying for decades. So advertising evolved. Campaigns became smarter. More persuasive. More ambitious. Smoking was associated with sophistication, success, adventure, freedom, confidence, even health. Yes, health. Today that sounds unbelievable. But there was a time when advertisements openly suggested that smoking was beneficial. Some campaigns featured doctors. Others implied medical approval. Many promised comfort and relaxation. The messaging was everywhere. Newspapers, magazines, billboards, movies, radio, eventually television. Entire generations grew up surrounded by these messages, and the results were enormous. Millions of people adopted smoking as a normal part of daily life, not because they understood its risks, because they often didn't. They trusted the information they were given, and that trust would eventually become one of the most controversial issues in modern history. Because while public enthusiasm was growing, troubling evidence was beginning to appear. Researchers started noticing patterns. Certain illnesses appeared more frequently among smokers. Lung disease, heart disease, cancer. At first, the connections were unclear. Then the evidence became harder to ignore. Study after study pointed in the same direction. The relationship wasn't random. Something serious was happening. And here's where the story takes a darker turn. Some tobacco companies didn't merely encounter this evidence. They possessed it. Internal research increasingly revealed the dangers. Scientists raised concerns. Data accumulated. Warning signs multiplied. Yet acknowledging those findings threatened profits. Enormous profits. So instead of responding immediately, many companies fought back. Questions were raised. Doubts were encouraged. Public uncertainty was cultivated. If people could be convinced that the science remained unsettled, many would continue smoking. And for years, that strategy proved remarkably effective. The consequences were staggering. Millions of people continued using products whose risks became increasingly clear. Advertising continued. Sales continued. Profits continued. Meanwhile, the human cost kept rising. What makes this chapter especially tragic is the contrast. Think back to the ancient communities we discussed earlier. Their smoke rituals were often communal, controlled, embedded within cultural traditions. They weren't designed to maximize consumption. They weren't engineered to create lifelong customers. They weren't driven by quarterly profits. Now compare that to industrial tobacco. Factories producing billions of cigarettes. Marketing campaigns targeting massive populations. Research focused on increasing consumption. The difference is enormous. Both involve smoke, but almost everything else changed. One emerged from tradition. The other emerged from commerce. One prioritized meaning. The other prioritized growth. And somewhere between those two worlds lies one of the most dramatic transformations in human history. A behavior that may have begun around prehistoric campfires had become a global industry worth unimaginable amounts of money. Yet despite all the changes, one mystery still remains. Why did smoking appear so consistently throughout human history in the first place? Why did so many different cultures independently discover similar practices? Why does the urge to alter consciousness seem to follow humanity across continents and centuries? To answer those questions, we need to step back even further. Beyond tobacco, beyond agriculture, beyond civilization itself, back to the fundamental behaviors that make us human. Because the final chapter of this story isn't really about smoking. It's about human nature. And why the oldest evidence may suggest that our relationship with smoke began almost as soon as we learned to control fire. We've traveled through ancient campfires, forgotten rituals, sacred ceremonies, early medicine, and global industries. But one question still remains. When did humans actually start smoking? The truth is, we probably won't ever know. And that's because the first person who intentionally inhaled smoke left behind no monument, no written record, and no trace that could survive tens of thousands of years. There is no ancient cave painting that says, "Today I discovered a plant that makes me feel strange." There is no preserved diary from a prehistoric hunter explaining what happened around the fire one evening. The beginning of this story existed long before writing, long before history, long before civilization itself. All we have are clues. And those clues point towards something remarkable. The oldest evidence we possess shows humans deliberately creating smoke experiences thousands of years ago. Ancient communities in Central Asia heated cannabis on hot stones. Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas incorporated tobacco into sacred traditions. Egyptian healers prescribed inhaled herbs. Indian physicians developed detailed systems of medicinal smoke. Greek doctors experimented with aromatic vapors. Different places, different cultures, different beliefs. Yet somehow they all arrived at a surprisingly similar idea. Smoke could change how people felt, sometimes physically, sometimes mentally, sometimes spiritually. And that recurring pattern is difficult to ignore. Because when societies separated by oceans and continents independently discover similar behaviors, it often suggests something deeper than coincidence. It suggests they may be responding to something fundamentally human. Perhaps that's why the story keeps appearing throughout history. Humans have always been curious about consciousness, about dreams, about visions, about unusual experiences, about anything capable of changing the way reality feels. That curiosity didn't begin in a laboratory. It didn't begin with philosophers. And it certainly didn't begin with modern science. It may be as old as humanity itself. Think back to those ancient fires. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived beside them, generation after generation. Night after night, smoke drifted through caves, through campsites, through shelters built from wood, bone, and animal skin. Every person who gathered around those flames experienced it. Every child born into those communities grew up breathing it. At some point, somebody noticed that not all smoke was the same. Certain plants smelled different. Certain plants produced different sensations. Certain plants created experiences people remembered. And humans are exceptionally good at remembering experiences that stand out. That's one of our greatest evolutionary strengths. We remember danger. We remember opportunity. And we remember anything that changes the way we experience the world. Once a pattern is noticed, experimentation follows. What caused that feeling? Can it happen again? Which plants create it? Which ones don't? Those simple questions may have started a chain reaction that lasted thousands of generations. Not because ancient people were trying to invent a ritual, not because they were attempting to create a tradition, but because curiosity naturally pushes humans toward discovery. The same curiosity that carried people across oceans. The same curiosity that built civilizations. The same curiosity that eventually placed humans on the moon. It may also have inspired someone to toss a particular plant into a fire and pay attention to what happened next. And once that knowledge existed, it could be shared, parent to child, elder to apprentice, storyteller to listener. For most of human history, knowledge wasn't stored in books. It lived inside people. A lesson learned by one generation survived only if someone remembered it. The campfire became humanity's first classroom, and smoke may have been one of its oldest subjects. Over time, those observations evolved. Simple discoveries became customs. Customs became traditions. Traditions became rituals. Some communities used smoke for healing. Others used it for spirituality. Others used it to strengthen social bonds. Many likely used it for all three. The meaning varied. The behavior remained. That's what makes this story so fascinating. The specific plants change from region to region. The explanations change from culture to culture. But the underlying pattern stayed remarkably consistent. Humans continued returning to smoke. Again, and again, and again. Not because every culture was connected, but because every culture contained people. And people share certain tendencies no matter where they live. One of those tendencies appears to be the desire to explore the mind itself, to understand consciousness, to experience something beyond ordinary daily life. Some researchers believe this drive is so universal that it may represent a fundamental part of human nature. The idea remains controversial, but history certainly provides plenty of evidence. Across virtually every continent and every era, humans repeatedly discovered methods for altering perception. Different substances, different rituals, different explanations. The same basic impulse, the desire to see reality from another angle. And smoking became one of the most effective ways to do it. Then came civilization. Agriculture spread. Cities emerged. Empires rose and fell. Writing appeared. Trade routes connected distant societies. And smoking continued. The practice adapted to each new world it entered. It survived political changes, religious changes, technological changes, economic changes. Through everything it endured. Eventually, tobacco transformed the story once again. What had often been sacred became commercial. What had been ritual became industry. What had been occasional became widespread. The scale changed dramatically. And so did the consequences. The modern tobacco industry would eventually reshape public health, economics, advertising, and politics on a global scale. Yet even that enormous chapter represents only a small fraction of a larger story. Because tobacco is not the beginning. It's one late chapter in a narrative that stretches far deeper into the past. A narrative that starts with fire. Without fire, none of this happens. No campfires, no smoke, no accidental discoveries. No rituals, no traditions, no industries, just darkness. Fire transformed human existence, and smoke came with it. The two have been companions ever since. Which brings us back to the original question. Why does smoking appear so consistently throughout human history? Why does it emerge in different places under different circumstances? Perhaps the answer isn't found in any single plant. Perhaps it isn't found in any single culture. Perhaps the answer lies in a uniquely human combination of curiosity, experimentation, and memory. Humans notice patterns. Humans repeat successful experiences. Humans pass discoveries to future generations. That simple process built everything from stone tools to modern science. And somewhere along the way, it also built humanity's long relationship with smoke. So, when was smoking invented? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe smoking wasn't invented at all. Maybe it was discovered repeatedly, by different people, in different places, across vast stretches of time. Each generation uncovering the same possibility hidden within fire and plants. And if that's true, then the origins of smoking may be impossible to pinpoint because they stretch back beyond history itself. Back to a world without cities, without writing, without records, a world illuminated only by firelight. Imagine one final scene. Night has fallen. A small group sits around glowing embers. The flames crackle softly. Smoke rises into the darkness. Someone notices something unusual. Someone becomes curious. Someone decides to try again. That moment disappears. No one records it. No one preserves it. Yet the idea survives, passed from person to person, generation to generation, century to century, until eventually it reaches us. And that's perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire story. Not that humans learn to smoke, but that a single observation made beside a forgotten fire may have echoed through tens of thousands of years of human history. A reminder that some of our oldest behaviors began not with grand inventions or powerful civilizations, but with curiosity, a fire, and a breath of smoke.